In the history of cinema, I can't think of any franchise celebrated as much as Star Wars. It's more of a phenomenon than I can even begin to recap. It seems everyone's seen these movies at a young age, and they leave a big impression in our minds. There's an overwhelming abundance of fan films and parodies.
I can't breathe in this thing!
People like to discuss these movies in great detail. People talk about the characters, the weapons, the vehicles, the planets. It all takes a life of its own that expands well beyond the 6 films it encompasses. Fans pick the movies apart in every detail. You could probably have a 2-hour conversation about that tree in the background. So, what can I say about Star Wars? Is there anything that hasn't been said? Well, I feel the only thing I can offer is my own personal impression and try to explain what makes these movies so important to me. I'm not going to talk about the holiday special or any of the animated epics. And I know a lot of you might be disappointed by that, but you gotta understand, I'm only talking about the 6 feature films and not every series and spin-off that comes along with it. Well, my story begins in 1983. You know that annoying little kid in the movie theater who cries and screams? Well, I was one of those kids. My parents took me to the movies all the time. 2 movies I saw that year was Return of the Jedi and Mr. Mom. But I think Return of the Jedi was much more cool. Though my memory is pretty vague, I can still see the image of Luke and Vader's lightsaber duel on the big screen. It was loud, it was larger than life, and it made a permanent impression on me forever. Throughout the 80s, I saw the trilogy on VHS and television many times growing up. I didn't always pay attention to the story. I didn't know why they had to go to the planet Endor. I didn't know why Luke had to find Yoda. At the time, all I cared about was how amazing it was. I'll always remember the bar scene from the first movie. Never before have I seen so many imaginative characters, some of them which only appear for brief moments. In Empire Strikes Back, I'll always remember the battle on Hoth. The walkers are still spectacular. In Return of the Jedi, I'll always remember the speeder bike chase in the woods. When they pass in the distance, that sound effect they make always lingered in my mind. Even small things were memorable, like that frog outside Jabba's palace. I always loved how distinct the 3 movies were from each other, each with their own landscapes. The first one made me think of desert, the second made me think of snow, and the third made me think of the woods. In the 80s, often they aired a special documentary about how they did the special effects. It was cool to see how creative they were, how everything was all miniatures, the puppets, the animatronics, even the sound effects were all done using really creative, organic means. It sparked my imagination and it made me interested in filmmaking. But once the 3 movies settled in, I asked my dad, why isn't there a 4th movie? And he said, there just isn't. So, waiting for the next film, I finally thought, well, it's not gonna happen. So I slowly lost interest in Star Wars and moved on to other things. By the time I reached my teenage years, I was kind of a film snob and I went through a bit of an anti-Star Wars phase. I didn't understand why people still talked about those movies so much. There were a lot of silly moments that stuck out in my head, mostly from Return of the Jedi. That stupid-looking blue elephant thing, the guy with the dick around his neck, Admiral Akbar, who I like to call Captain Fishhead. There were just a lot of weird characters. Perhaps I felt it was a kid's thing and I grew out of it. But another thing that may have attributed to my brief disinterest in Star Wars was how unoriginal the movies seemed to me at the time. It's true that George Lucas was influenced by several films, but that's only what makes the movies so great. In 1995, the pre-special edition trilogy was re-released on VHS for the last time. This is when I saw the movies again and realized how amazing they really were. From a more mature perspective, I was able to understand how it paid tribute to movies of the past. The Flash Gordon serials are the prime example, right from the opening title scroll. That's exactly where it came from. Even Cloud City was from Flash Gordon and all the wipe transitions. And the whole idea of the serial was that it happened in episodes. It was all part of one larger story. Star Wars sort of picked up with the same idea. The way the first movie begins, it puts you right into the action to make you feel that there's a lot of backstory that you missed. That's how it was in the 30s and 40s. You'd go to see a movie, and before the feature presentation, you might see an episode of Flash Gordon. But unless you went to the movies all the time, you were probably going to only see a few episodes. That's how it was. But no matter what, you were always able to get right into the story. And let's not forget Metropolis, one of the most famous science fiction films of all time. It was one of the first to create a separate reality the way it did, a world run by technology. The robot in Metropolis bears a close resemblance to C-3PO. The Walkers, of course, are very much like the Martian war machines in the H.G. Wells novel War of the Worlds. It also reminds me of Wizard of Oz. I can't help but feel that C-3PO is the Tin Man and Chewbacca is the Cowardly Lion. The way they meet all these different characters as they go along their journey, it's classic. The Jawas are like the Munchkins, the hologram of the Emperor is like the hologram of the Wizard, Yoda and Obi-Wan disappear when they die, so does the Wicked Witch. When they disguise themselves as stormtroopers is like when they disguise themselves as the Witch's soldiers. There's of course many references to the Kurosawa films, most notably The Hidden Fortress. It's about a princess leading a gang of rebels against an evil empire. It tells the story from the point of view of two humble characters, the same way as R2-D2 and C-3PO. We have samurais, whereas in Star Wars we have Jedis. We can't help but make the connection between lightsabers and swords. The severing of arms is also something you'd see in a samurai film. There's also a lot of references to Western films. The bar scene in Mos Eisley is right out of any given classic Western. The Searchers is one that gets brought up a lot. The scene where Luke's home gets raided and his family burned, that's the same thing that happens in The Searchers. There's also a lot of references to horror films. The casting of Peter Cushing alongside David Prowse as Vader, I feel is no coincidence. In Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, Cushing was Dr. Frankenstein and Prowse was the monster. But also it's worthy to mention that Peter Cushing often played Dr. Van Helsing in Hammer's Dracula series. And Christopher Lee, who played Dracula, is now Count Dooku. No coincidence. Even Darth Vader rising from the slab is a scene right out of Frankenstein. And you can't help but feel Vader's cape comes from Dracula.
I am Dracula.
And notice how the titles are all inspired by B-movies, especially the new ones like Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. There's this old serial called The Phantom Creep starring Bela Lugosi. The name of the first episode is The Menacing Power. Phantom. Menace. The characters are all famous archetypes. Luke is the classic hero, Obi-Wan's the classic mentor, much like Frodo and Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, or King Arthur and Merlin from Sword in the Stone. But there's so much more to it, I've barely scratched the surface. And it's not like nobody knows about this, there's a wealth of information on Star Wars influences all over the internet. But the fact that Star Wars takes old ideas and makes them into something new shows how ingenious it really is. It's not like it's plagiarizing, it's just that all ideas in general come from somewhere. It pays tribute to all these old movies, literature, folklore, mythology, and ultimately reflects our culture. It perfectly blends science fiction and fantasy. The science fiction element's obvious. It deals with technology and things that could possibly exist. But the fantasy element comes into play with the Force, for example. It's a less technological thing and more of a magical one. Of course, they had to ruin that in The Phantom Menace with the biological explanation of how the Force works. It's funny how many people think Star Wars takes place in the future, even though the beginning clearly says a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's a fairy tale. But it's also interesting to think how history repeats itself. Lucas said he based the Emperor off of historical figures from Julius Caesar to Adolf Hitler. He said you start out in a democracy, and democracy turns into a dictatorship, and then the rebels make it back into a democracy. So it's like there's always going to be rebels. It's like a cycle. This also applies to the character arc of Anakin Skywalker. He's a tragic hero, and his son Luke begins to follow the same footsteps, doomed to take the same path. It's like a cycle again. It takes classic science fiction, Japanese culture, Western culture, biblical references, and retells them all at the same time. It's every epic story ever told rolled into one. And the common audience doesn't notice this, but it all seems so familiar in your head, and that's why I think these movies have such a powerful appeal. Star Wars is more than just movies. It's everything. It's the force that binds us.